Hello, hello. We're back on the Fight Sites MMA podcast, and that hello was completely intentional because we have a special guest, as you probably know from clicking on this podcast. Connor Ruebusch of Heavy Hands has joined us. He's joined us before.
Whoa. Excuse me, sir. Don't mispronounce my last name like that. It's Ruebusch, okay? You don't know what it's like to have people mispronounce your last name.
I have to give that back.
You don't know what it's like, all right?
Do we need to start this over, Sriram?
No, I don't think so. I think that's good.
Yeah, I think that's great. Given how I pronounced Sriram's name when he was on my show, I think that's fair enough.
Payback. Yeah, we're very happy to have Connor on our show because he's had us both on their show before, and it was delightful. So with me, as always, Danny Martin, who you heard laugh just a couple moments ago. How you doing, Danny?
Just living the dream. We got a good discussion going today. We are foregoing our usual weekly scheduling. We'll probably pick it up next week, but we picked up another guest because we just can't get enough of those. And we have a really fun kind of broad stroke discussion about MMA as a sport today. And who better to discuss this with than the third best host of Heavy Hands, Connor Ruebusch.
Clearly only two other people better to discuss this with, but I'm happy to fill in. I'm sorry, I shouldn't mention his name. He hates when I do that.
We had to go down the checklist.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much. I just wanted to be known that I did bring my Kyle MacLachlan energy today, all right? So unlike the nice, sweet, thoughtful performances you guys gave on my show, I'm just going to be a dick.
I don't know, Kyle's inimitable.
Well, it's true. I could try the accent, but they also hate when I do that. So I'm very happy to be here, though, guys. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So we're going to start out with what we, I guess, usually do, which is the review of last week's thing, which was surprisingly not depressing. I think we all expected it to be at least a little bit depressing. Robert Whittaker and Darren Till. So, Connor, if you want to start us off, what were your initial thoughts on Robert Whittaker and how he performed?
Well, I came away from it with mixed thoughts. I had a mixed reaction. On the one hand, I thought Darren Till has officially gotten better, which was cool. I thought he showed a few new wrinkles, particularly his counterpunching was not quite as void as I've seen it in the past. It was a very useful asset for him. The flip side, of course, is, I say it was useful because Robert Whittaker ran into way too many counters. I'm more willing than ever to believe the sort of doom and gloom stuff that you guys like to spread whenever a beloved fighter does poorly. It's a better argument than ever before to say that Whittaker is slipping a bit, perhaps showing the wear and tear of the Romero fights and everything else. On the other hand, I did come away with it, I think, with a clearer idea of what exactly has made Whittaker struggle so much in his three notable UFC losses, the Wonderboy one, Adesanya, and then this wasn't a loss, but it was a lot closer than I expected. I came into this expecting Whittaker to kind of do a Masvidal style flurry and knock Darren Till out at some point. So basically my feeling on Whittaker now is that he just does not like that range. He doesn't like long range fighters with a reach advantage. It seems to make him really uncomfortable. I can't tell if that's entirely responsible for what seems to be some technical regression, but it does seem to be a common thread between Wonderboy, Adesanya, and now this, which is, in my opinion, the worst version of the long, lanky counterpuncher that he has fought to date. And he still didn't look like the best Robert Whittaker I've ever seen. I mean, there's no denying that. The crazy blitzes, the wild swings. I think the fact that Till was a southpaw may have added to that some more. The open stance and the longer range that it created. So I'm not yet ready to say that Whittaker's done. I'm certainly more intrigued by the idea that he's past his best now. But really, I came away from it thinking, man, he does not look at his best when he's fighting someone who's longer than him and who wants to counter him when he rushes in.
Yep, I think I co-sign with all that. And I'm glad you pointed out the fact that we can now sort of deduce some of the problems that Whittaker has, because Whittaker's had such a strange run at middleweight. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that it hasn't been good. It's just he had, almost an hour of fight time with one person who's, a pretty notorious person to have. And then it's sort of hard to look at the Adesanya fight and figure out what to take from it. Like it does feel like we have just more of a sample size. Even going back to like the Uriah Hall fight, was a bit scrappier than I think most people expected it to.
Absolutely. It's a great fight too.
Yeah, it's a really good fight. And I don't think it's really a knock on Whittaker that he had to figure some things out against Hall. It was more just, we can look at Hall, Adesanya, Thompson, and we can start seeing some kind of, until now, we can start seeing some trend lines. I think part of the thing that exacerbates Whittaker's problems with like longer rangier opponents is that it can kind of cost him his own jab. Like Rob he has a natural sense of counterpunching, which I like. And you can see that like the first exchange was Till tried to kind of pressure in.
He relied on it a lot more here than he did. I mean, I think it may have been trickier to lean on the counterpunching against Adesanya, who's just a much more deft kicker and long-range striker. But I was glad to see him, despite all of the crazy blitzes. They were, I think, a little better chosen than they were against Adesanya.
Yeah, I would completely co-sign that. But like I said, he's got a natural sense of countering, like his jab when he can kind of intercept people with it. And he intercepted Adesanya with it a few times. It's very like he just has a really good sense of staying safe, and I like seeing that. He is more susceptible on the lead than I think we've given credit for in the past, because he gets compared to Galvin Gastelum a lot. And while I fully admit that I think Whittaker is a smarter, more dimensional fighter than Gastelum, Gastelum does kind of have one thing that Whittaker lacks, and that Gastelum can put himself in range with his feet over him planted more easily. Rob tends to, like, he can start his combinations from way outside. He did that against Adesanya, and he had a little bit of trouble here, where he starts way back, and then he has to try to feint his way in, and he has a large swath of distance to collapse to get in range, and then he immediately has to angle out.
Yeah.
And so when you're fighting a more static opponent like a Jacare or a Romero, like, that becomes easier to do, because the chances of them taking an angle on you as you come in, or trying to outposition you, is fairly low. If you enter on them, Rob has a good sense of like where they are in proximity to him. He knows like how to bridge the gap. His jab is a much easier tool to do that with. But I think your point about the southpaw was also wise, in that Till could obstruct the lead hand, which is, again, Adesanya did that deftly, and they can, he can adjust as Whittaker is entering from a long ways away. So that's something. I think there was definitely something to consider there. On the flip side, one of the biggest lessons I took from Darren Till is, if you take angles on Darren Till, he has a lot of issues. Like, it's just really that simple. Like,
also, if you throw more than 10 strikes around, Darren Till tends to have issues.
Well, sure. I mean, yeah, I would definitely agree on that. But I was just kind of looking at the footwork side of things, and I was like, wow, he really struggles when guys try to angle in on him. He would, Rob would use a outside angle to take the outside leg kick and then just pivot off, and Till had to turn every time. Like, this is where a lack of a right hook hurts him. This is, you have a guy taking an angle on you and then pivoting off to his left. This is basically where Poirier made his hay against Max in the early rounds of their fight. So yes, I think that there was definitely a lot of improvement from Darren Till as far as the counterpunching. We can actually say, as you said on Twitter, he is something of a counterpuncher now, which he's actually earned that title. But I was not quite as down on Whittaker as I expected to be. There was a lot of veteran savvy and guile, and Sriram, I know you were thinking about that too.
See, you shielded yourself with a heavy hands classic Sadness Hedge. That's why you were more pleasantly surprised, whereas I was like, I came into this thinking even the Whittaker who fought Adesanya would obliterate Till, so I was disappointed.
Still a little disappointed. It's all
Unlike
about expectation.
you two, I'm not a coward.
Yeah, let's switch it to Sriram. What'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much on the same page. I think the doom and gloom that we've generally had with fighters returning has actually been pleasantly subverted in a lot of the recent fights. Because, Dustin Poirier off a bad title loss came back, looked pretty much prime against Dan Hooker. Jimmy Rivera came back after a pretty rough two-fight skid. He looked sharp as hell against Cody Stamann. And Whittaker kind of kept that trend going. I agree with the same things, the length. I think Whittaker likes being an in-and-out short combo sort of fighter. So, when that initial step takes him in, he can just start swinging and go with, one or two punches, which is what he did with Jacare, and then, weave out or angle out. But here he had to cover distance behind his strikes. And that meant that by the time he got to 4, 5, 6, it was just his feet were all over the place. So Adesanya kind of did the same thing where, Adesanya would angle off and Whittaker had to, keep swinging, which was rough. But I think there's some value, and we're going to get to the value adjustments later. But there's some value in how Whittaker figured out the fight with, the outside leg kick. He got that for free every day. And the transitional work, which was something that we hadn't really seen from Whittaker before, but he seemed to have a good idea of how to do it. His bursty sort of approach, I think a lot of us suspected that it would do well for reactive takedowns. He used those entries well. He would get in on a single and break with left hooks. He did that a lot. And at the end of the fight, he just used that to make up for the blood optics. So that was very smart. And yeah, I mean, it was, as you mentioned, it was a veteran sort of fight from Whittaker, not necessarily prime, but also it wasn't an easy fight for him because of the length. I think he'll look probably better against a Cannonier or a Costa, but I'm still worried because this is one more knockdown that he's taken in 3 fights that have been really, really nasty. So
I think the fact that Till did a really good job feinting and pressuring, I thought. He stayed on Whittaker. I would have liked to have seen Whittaker press forward more. I think that's a little more natural for him to just be to be leading the dance. But I also think the super low output of Till, another facet of his game that people seem to just overlook all the time. I think that was difficult as well because Whittaker came into this looking, wanting to do more counterpunching. I said earlier that maybe Adesanya would have had a field day with that more back foot approach. But on the other hand, Adesanya would have given him a lot more reads and a lot more things to actually build a counter game off of. So yeah, I think that this version of Darren Till was in fact a much harder stylistic matchup than I anticipated. So that's why I'm just not sure how to feel about. I mean, I need to see Whittaker against. Just make the Jacare rematch. Just let's see that again, so I can get a barometer for where he's really at.
I think we're at a point where Darren Till is going to make our favorite fighters generally look kind of like trash because he's very big and he's doesn't really do that much. So it's going to take a guy who's comfortable on the lead covering distance against someone who has the reputation of a counterpuncher, even if he's more of one now, but still not much of one. So it's if you look at if Darren Till happened to face Adesanya, I'd expect that to be a complete mismatch because of the kicking thing alone, but it would not be an entertaining fight in my opinion because Till just wouldn't really do all that much and Adesanya would just take what he's given, and that's what most fighters do. So I think that fights against Till kind of have to be tempered in that way, I suspect.
I guess this is kind of a good transitional piece to the main topic of the podcast, but when after the Whittaker Adesanya fight, I didn't actually feel I didn't look like Whittaker was. It didn't look like Whittaker was so completely out of his depth that I'd never pick him to win. It looked like a fight where I was like, okay, Whittaker clearly keyed in on the wrong things. I don't think he necessarily had a bad strategy coming in, but I don't think he adjusted well enough to really make it work. And he went in against an opponent who had clearly done a ton of training and tape study on Whittaker's exact tendencies that he just kind of couldn't help but play into. But I said that if there probably exists a different approach for Whittaker, and with a different one, I think he might still be able to win that fight. If there was one sad takeaway from this fight, was probably that I don't know if I really believe that anymore. And it's because like I said, it's that sample size thing. Now we have seen more rangy opponents who are can time Rob on entry, or can just make him commit from way on the outside where there's just a large amount of time for the opponent to adjust and angle, and like that. And where Whittaker's, his best work, as I said, it largely came off the counter. It's the leads that kind of concern me. I was like, that is actually seems like a harder sell for me.
I more or less feel the same way. I mean, I'll phrase it this way. I think it is eminently possible for that Whittaker would make the right adjustments to win that fight next time. I think it's in fact likely that he could come into the rematch and do much better. But whether or not Robert Whittaker himself is capable of making those adjustments, you know what I mean? Like the technical adjustments are available for Whittaker's style to work. But having seen the larger sample size of this kind of matchup, I'm more doubtful of whether or not Whittaker can actually make those reads and stick to the right adjustments. I don't know.
It's clear he just doesn't like it. It's clearly not the kind of fight that he's super comfortable in.
As he said himself, that was a super stressful fight. You know, that was his first words in the post-fight interview was, "Oh my God, that was stressful." It was clear he just wasn't enjoying it the way he does. I think he enjoyed fighting Derek Brunson a lot more than he enjoyed this, and that fight was insane. Yeah.
So again, it was good to see Whittaker get a win. It was nice to see him, beat Darren Till over 5 rounds. It's good to see that he's still able to push a pace and things like that. But I do feel like we have a bigger sample size and a more revealing sample size of exactly what type of fighter is likely to give Robert Whittaker issues. So it was clearly packed with a lot of lessons. There's a lot of meaning in that fight, and so there's always something to discuss there. But that is actually a good segue into the main topic of the podcast, which is going to be, as we said earlier, adjustments. I will kind of piggyback off something Connor said, which is when you have a performance like Whittaker's against Adesanya, where, as I kind of alluded to before, it wasn't a bad approach necessarily, but he just sort of keyed into the wrong things against an opponent who was clearly keying into the right things. When a first fight between fighters goes really catastrophically badly for one guy, especially in a title situation, it is generally a good expectation that a second fight won't go quite that badly. Because when you have a fighter approach a fight just categorically wrong, the possibilities for improvement are gargantuan.
Right.
Which is kind of a strange sort of lesson to take from it. But if you really show up and things go just haywire, that does mean that there is often a lot of possibility for things to be improved the second time around. Now, it makes it hard to pick. I realize it's hard to pick a losing fighter to win a second fight around. That was one of the reasons that I was hesitant to pick Holloway, even though I said in my, staff pick, I was like, I think there's actually room for Max to give Volkanovski some serious issues if he's taking the right lessons. It's a hard thing to trust, but the possibilities are there. And I think when you can actually make those happen, a second fight being closer in those types of situations it's generally not as weird as it might seem. Sriram, does this sound normal? Am I talking out of my ass?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. The big exception we saw recently was Figueiredo and Benavidez, but Max and Volkanovski makes a great point, and even that was probably just physical decline. But yeah, in general, I think if you look at, for example, we were talking about Whittaker and Romero. That's a great example, where Whittaker seemed to kind of have Romero solved by the end of the first fight, at least in terms of the approach he had to take with, just weaponizing his pace and kicking him in the body a lot. And then Romero came in the second fight, and he's a uniquely smart fighter, but he came in the second fight with a completely different strategy and gave Whittaker absolute hell. So there are a lot of examples of trilogies like that. Max and Volkanovski is another one. I think there are specifically unadaptive fighters to whom that doesn't apply, but in general, fighters tend to think when they're off a loss more than they are when they're off a win.
I think it's actually very common that the loser just they have things to work on. I mean, you need to work on stuff when you lose, whereas even the winner of a very close fight. I think, there are two ways to talk about adjustments, right? You can talk about adjustments made on the fly. You can talk about adjustments made from one fight to the next. I think adjustments made on the fly they tend to be more sustainable because they just kind of come out of who the fighter naturally is. Adjustments made between fights that are sort of like larger, changing the architecture of your style kind of adjustments. I think Holloway Volkanovski is a great example of how those can be a bit shallower, because I think we all agree Max Holloway made beautiful adjustments to the rematch with Volkanovski. Like, he came in and started doing all the right things, right? I was blown away. And immediately my reaction was, this guy said he didn't have a training camp, and he's a liar, because I don't believe it. That was way too – his performance was too prescient. It was on point. But despite his early success, and this is Max Holloway, this is a guy who builds, that's his whole thing. Despite that early success, he kind of reverted to classic Max Holloway by the final 3 rounds. The really active kicking game was not really there anymore. Like, the disengaging footwork wasn't there anymore. He was just chasing Volkanovski with more combinations. So that interests me as well. I think there's more room for the loser to grow, but I think the style dynamic is always still sort of there under the surface. And unless the adjusting fighter, the one who lost in the first fight, like, wins early, I do think you tend to see that as the fight plays out.
Yeah, and that kind of filters into the next point, which is like, how do you rebuild like a fighter's context? Because there's an example that I'm thinking of. If you're looking at like sort of fight to fight adjustments, there is one that comes to mind as a kind of a bad example, or an example that just failed, was Lando Venata. Where I think, Venata clearly heard some of the criticism of like, he's getting hit too much, he needs to work on his defense, and his response was, okay, I need to be like a safer, I need to do something different.
Joe Rogan's technical fighter. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then I think it was, what the hell was it? Matt Frivola. I think it was actually Phil who keyed in on it. It was like, it looked like Venata was like trying to be a safer fighter, and he just looked super weird. Yeah, like, nothing fit at all. Nothing was inherent. It seemed like he had to think through all of his moves. I think another, when you see a fighter trying to think their way through every single move, they just tend to get exhausted. I think Mirsad Bektic is another example of someone you can just visibly just gets anxious, either trying to follow corner advice or do what they've been taught. It's just not a natural, like, either they just don't exist in like a natural context, or they've been, whatever they've built for themselves has kind of been broken down.
TriStar did a number on that boy, unfortunately. I think another fantastic example of someone making a style adjustment unsuccessfully, at least so far. And again, these things, when you do make a full, revamp, it can work, but it at least takes a while, a few fights to really become natural. But Alexander Hernandez, knocked out by Donald Cerrone, been a totally different, far more passive fighter since, and it's not been working better for him, So,
which is, so like, it's sort of adjusting within, you either have to adjust within the context of who you are, and we'll probably talk about that a bit, or you have to like rebuild the context, in which case you are opening up a lot of doors for things to go awry for a fighter. Like that, like I said, that's where fighters have to think through their approach. That's where they have to like almost try to micromanage, or coaches try to micromanage their fighters.
Yeah.
Or they start doing something that they're used to, and their coaches try to reel it back, or whatever their new adjustments make, they just kind of fall out over time. It's like, I think it requires a specific kind of fighter to do that. Like, I don't think those kinds of things are available for everybody. Sriram?
Yeah. I think Kevin Lee is a good example of the TriStar thing. Now that Connor mentioned that,
Mm.
because if you look at like what he does well, he's like a big pressure wrestler who's like super strong against the cage, and then he went to TriStar, which is make everyone into a back foot jabber, and it worked against Gillespie, but Gillespie isn't like the best test. And then he went against Oliveira, and like Oliveira worked when he wrestled him, but he just kept back foot jabbing, and it didn't work at all. Like Kevin Lee, he's basically like a machine, in that if you give him something, he'll just keep doing it. And that's something good if he's given the right plan that plays to his strengths, but that kind of didn't. So like it could work moving forward, but there it just didn't. And that's a good example of, when a fighter is kind of taken away from what they do and they kind of have to think through everything that they do. So like you can look at a bunch of Kevin Lee fights where like if he fights the right fight, he'll keep going through it, and if he fights the wrong fight, he'll also keep going through it. So it's an interesting case.
I think I'm gonna name an example of someone who I think very successfully changed styles that dramatically, and why it worked, and that's Alistair Overeem, who in the transition from Ubereem to Medium Ream became a largely back foot, sort of outfighting, occasionally counterpunching, this sort of like evasive, slow paced fighter. And that's nothing like the Alistair Overeem like kickboxing rooted style that we all came to know. That's nothing like 2009, 2012, whatever, earlier period Ream. It's hard to come up with a good name for each phase of Ream's career, by the way, because he's been at it forever. But you know what I'm talking about. From the super aggressive guy who knocked out Badr Hari, massive shift. And I've always seen that. You guys have probably heard me say this in various different things. I've always seen that as like a victory of framing, like how that change is framed, how that fighter feels about the change they're making, why they feel like they're doing it. I think is very important, because a lot of like the tactics a trainer will tack on to a fighter, they're basically like either papering over or like augmenting sort of all the insecurities and neuroses that make that fighter who they are. You know what I mean? So like, if your guy's super impatient, you're better off developing tools that either work with that, like making him a pressure fighter, giving him a crazy active pumping jab, whatever, making him a combination puncher, really focusing on those things, or papering over the flawed aspects of that, right? And really those tools kind of do the same. Like being impatient can be bad, but if you equip your guy with lots of tools that make his impatience a weapon, you've sort of made it no longer a flaw in the same sense. You've made it an asset. For Overeem, I always thought he was just a bully. And I always looked at the shift from aggressive pressure fighting bruiser to back foot outfighter as just a different context of how it feels to bully someone. The example I always used was, instead of smashing you into the locker, now he drives by and hits you with a bat from the passenger window of his friend's car. You know what I mean? Or he knocks your mailbox over, right? But it's still like he can pinch his nose and say, nah, and you can't get me. It's still like he feels a sense of power. It's especially easy for that adjustment, I think, in the heavyweight division, where the options for how you can bully your big, slow, dumb opponents are many. But that's how I always saw it, right? It didn't make Overeem less confident than he was. In fact, I think it was sort of a necessary change, because as he got older, the pattern of his super aggressive style gassing him clearly became worse and worse. So he needed to make an adjustment, but it was critical that adjustment still allowed him to feel that he was like above his opponent, that he was in control, right? I guess one way to put this would be that all styles are about how do you feel comfortable seizing and holding the initiative, and you have to allow your fighter to still do that with whatever changes you make. You don't want them to become, like Danny said, so passive and so thoughtful that they just end up hesitating. It has to feel natural. And I think, I don't know, it sounds kind of foo-foo-y, I guess, but how that's framed, how that fits the fighter's personality, I think makes a big difference.
I think a kind of in tandem with that, with the Overeem example, is you can also just sort of look at it's interesting to see how a fighter's like professional experience, especially early, how that can shape them and shift them long term. Because I think with Overeem, he quickly learned that like trying to be a more aggressive pressure fighter meant that he was just walking onto shots.
Yeah.
He was walking onto big shots from big punchers. And so like, yes, it took him a couple losses to get there, but of the times that Overeem's lost recently in the last couple years, I can't think of many that have been from him being overly aggressive and just trying to swamp his opponent. He lost to like Curtis Blades. He just got exhausted. Like he just couldn't keep up with Blades' pace, but he does a better job of sort of recognizing the problems that he was having early with just trying to walk people down and strong them.
Mm-hmm.
And so he can look to that experience and be like, okay, there are elements of this that can work, but overall, like I think the context needs shifting. The counter example, and I think we're going to kind of be bouncing through a lot of these, is Shane Burgos for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because Shane Burgos is someone who after his first loss to Calvin Kattar, in a terrific fight with, some surprising adjustments for someone who was like 4 years into their career, I was like, wow, like there's a lot of upside there. Even though he got finished, I was like, man, I wonder what he can build on here, because he seemed to be building well against Kattar and just kind of got caught.
Right.
The problem then was that it just doesn't, for Shane Burgos, it doesn't look like he's really learned a lot from his losses, or the issues, the times that he's had issues. It seems like his immediate response is just get back up and keep pushing harder. And when that's your takeaway, there's a far more likely chance that you just start running into the same thing over and over and over again. When you can't like learn from your mistakes and learn from the context, it can be harder to like identify what needs to be changed.
Don't you think that's most fighters though? Like that's most careers, right?
Yeah.
Some people just sort of fall into their style. It's because it suits them. It's like a personality. Like most people don't change. And I truly believe that, most people don't change much, at least. They may paper over their personality with different new tics and traits and fascinations or whatever, but by the end of their lives, most people are pretty much the person they were when they were like 17. And I truly believe that fighting style is so closely linked to personality that it's the same thing. I knew a boxing trainer in Vegas, a very smart guy, who I used to shout out a lot more, named Luis Monda. And he very unironically used clips from the movie, I guess it's just called Secretariat. It's about Secretariat, the horse. He used clips from that movie to talk about training fighters. And like what you said before, Danny, like you sort of suggested that Overeem was like traumatized by what happened in the Travis Brown fight, for example, and successfully made adjustments as a result of that. That's how horses are. Like horses are very traumatizable. They're very skittish. If something bad happens to them in one spot, they're going to be nervous every time they walk past that spot. And that's what the movie is all about, is like building the horse's confidence, like getting them back to like a healthy emotional state. And that's what allows the horse to run. I think fighters are exactly the same. Like, I don't mean to disparage fighters, but, and this doesn't have anything to do with Overeem's diet, but fighters are horses. And good trainers are aware of that. And I think, I don't know, you have to deal with the sort of trauma because otherwise your fighters are just going to be having the same losses, only worse and worse over the courses of their career.
Yeah, I mean, I think one interesting thing that goes from Shane Burgos specifically is that we've kind of been talking about fighters making adjustments in terms of like their overall career, which is like, how a person matures, if we're going to take that sort of analogy. But I think the problem for Emmett specifically was that he didn't make an adjustment based on his opponent, right? Like if we're looking at a fighter who makes an adjustment based on the flaws that they see consistently in themselves, that's one thing that we talked about with Bektik and like Lee and like, but with Burgos, his style wasn't inherently flawed. It just ran into a guy who it would require more risk taking than he probably should have. And I think the problem there is that, as you mentioned, a lot of fighters don't make one fight adjustments. There's a reason why one of the performances I talk about a lot is Michael Johnson versus Edson Barboza, because that's like one of the few examples I can think of from a notably stupid fighter who actually did that, turning from an out fighter to a pressure fighter for a single fight because of his opponent. It just doesn't happen. So I think that's another thing where you can see a guy making broad strategic changes because of themselves more than you can see a guy doing that because of a specific opponent. And even that's mostly in rematches. In first fights, that just it just doesn't happen.
I think that's there are doers and there are thinkers in fighting. And I don't know, I would guess based on that Michael Johnson's just more of a doer. Like you equip him with the tools, you tell him what to do, and he goes out and does it.
Certainly not a thinker.
Well, I think Justin Gaethje is like that too. You know, like Trevor Whitman tells him what to do, and he just goes out there and does it. And you can see a difference between like Rose Namajunas being given the correct adjustments by Trevor Whitman and Justin Gaethje being given similar adjustments. One has a much easier job actually sticking to those than the other. And I think it's because Rose Namajunas starts to overthink. She's just a more thoughtful fighter in general, so she just has a harder time sticking to the game plan.
I think with this kind of discussion, it's easy to look at the standout good examples and want to extrapolate from them, because I think Gaethje is a good example of that. And you know, Michael Johnson against Barboza, Overeem's kind of whole shift. It's easy to look at the like the good adjustments and want to key in on those, but I think it just is a far more likely thing. I can think of a lot more examples of fighters making the wrong adjustments or, you know, making no adjustments, because it's just kind of what we've come to expect. I mean, one of the most basic rules of following combat sports past a certain point is you just kind of look at someone and you say, you are probably going to be who you are. You know, you can't expect, you know, I like even picking Gaethje over Ferguson, I was not expecting Gaethje to fight the way he did. No. Like I think we even discussed a little bit, Sriram and I talked about it. Like if he wants to play the same game he played against Cerrone, like I said, there's a good chance that he tries it for a round, feels like it's not working, and then just sort of walks Tony down with his old style. Like, you know, and if something goes wrong for Gaethje, there's a good chance he probably just kind of reverts back to what he did before. But obviously that didn't happen.
Instead, he went back to the corner. Trevor Whitman gave him 2 pieces of advice, and then he did the same thing but better for the rest of the fight.
Yeah, exactly. So there's, you know, that's kind of a notable example on one side of the spectrum. But with making these adjustments, we talk a lot about the fighters, but I do think it is also important to discuss how the coaches approach those as well, because, you know, with someone who was having a serious issue making any kind of changes in like Anthony Pettis, or, you know, as I say, Anthony Pettis kind of went about it the wrong way after he lost the title. He basically thought that his problem was, people can take me down. I need to get better at defending takedowns. And so he did. He got better at defending takedowns, and he got no better at putting himself or getting himself off the fence, or, you know, comfortable
having
defense.
Anything resembling footwork.
Yeah, or having a really consistent way to, you know, apply and measure offense, whatever. All these sorts of pieces. Those were all like crucial elements that needed attention, but he kind of fixed a tangential problem. Which, again, that's not that you shouldn't train your takedown defense, but he could also see Pettis having a lot of the same problems, like over and over and over and over again, and he's just sort of out there thinking like why is this not working? And I think past a certain point, he probably just learned all that he could from Duke Roufus. Like I don't know if there was much. I mean maybe not. Maybe Sergio Pettis was just. Sergio was just taking all of Duke Roufus's time with footwork, and there was no time left over for Anthony. I don't really know. But it did kind of feel like after a certain point, his training under that one coach started to stagnate a bit. And it has been notable that there are people who've done kind of, walkabouts, if you will, visiting places and getting different tutelage, that's kind of that's where people start to realize, oh, there's a whole breadth of this stuff that I don't really know that well. Maybe you don't find the right match right away, but there's a certain kind of, there's a point at which you can tell that a fighter and a coach click, and it's the fighter. Maybe that's the connection. Like the fighter is the doer, and the coach has to be the thinker. And that if there's like, if the coach just, can't find the necessary adjustments that need to be met, then it's difficult for the fighter to employ them. But if
I don't know. I think it's there are some coaches that I think work better with more thoughtful fighters. I think Firas Zahabi's style looks kind of clunky with Kevin Lee, but it works really well for some very thoughtful fighters. I'm forgetting his name. Matt Hume is DJ's trainer, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I was blanking on it for a minute. Matt Hume, obviously, like Demetrius Johnson, is a tremendously thoughtful fighter, like inhumanly active in his brain during a firefight. And I think Matt Hume's like encyclopedic style of fighter preparation obviously works very well for him, almost perhaps uniquely well for him, because it's not like Matt Hume is producing a lot of other great fighters. So I don't know. I think there's room for both styles. I just think the difficulty of going and shopping around for a coach that's going to make broad changes to your game is, to quote something former fighter Cody Gibson said to me on Twitter just yesterday, whatever your percentage of how many fighters are dumb as shit is, double it. I think a lot of fighters, like even the ones who are quote unquote thinkers, it's kind of a crapshoot which trainer they end up going to. Like if Kevin Lee had gone to like Rafael Cordero, that probably would have suited him a lot better than Firas Zahabi. But if I don't know, if Rory McDonald went to Rafael Cordero, it probably that doesn't sound like a good fit. It doesn't sound right. So I don't know. It's difficult. I think there's room for both thoughtful and dumb robotic fighters, but not all coaches work equally well with both types. In fact, very few do. I think Trevor Whitman, for example, has recently shown he can do work with both. But yeah, it's two different mindsets.
Yeah, I think Team Alpha Male is a surprising example of that, because if you look at Cody Garbrandt, he's by definition a doer. He's not a thinker at all. And Team Alpha Male kind of just made him double down on that over and over, I think, because they're not a particularly thoughtful team either. They're very good at like finding athletes and giving them basic tools, but past that, they're not a game planning camp. And right. Cody Garbrandt, when he went into the second TJ fight, it did not go well. And it did not go well, not just because he didn't have the tools for it, it's because he didn't have any way to apply it. Now you compare that to Josh Emmett, who in the Shane Burgos fight looked incredibly thoughtful when going into the third round. He built on his successes, and suddenly the simple tools the Team Alpha Male gave him, they were in a completely different context. And I'm not sure Team Alpha Male was the one that necessarily bred that into him, but I think Josh Emmett is inherently a little bit more thoughtful than Cody Garbrandt, so it worked out a bit more.
I think so. I am a little bit doubtful of whether Alpha Male bred that into him. I can't tell you how I know this, but one suggested game plan from a Team Alpha Male coach for Josh Emmett when he was fighting Mirsad Bektic was to do what Darren Elkins did to beat Mirsad Bektic.
Oh my God, I remember that Twitter conversation with.
Yeah, they're like we think he should just. It worked for Darren. Let's have him go out there and wrestle Bektic, and it's like no, knock him out on the feet, which is what he ended up doing. But yeah, so I'm not sure about Alpha Male, but I think generally it's a doer's gym.
This is sort of why this is a difficult topic to breach, because every fighter, like as you said, fighters. A style and a personality are quite closely linked, and you definitely can see examples where things go awry. Like who the hell was the the Team Alpha Male guy who kind of got concussed and then retired? It was
Holdsworth.
Chris Holdsworth. Thank you. Yes, I couldn't pin the name. There were kind of stories about Holdsworth being a really just natural talent at MMA. But under the tutelage of like Dwayne Ludwig, it seemed like he was kind of being a bit overexerted in training. It sounded like it didn't seem like it felt like it would be a perfect fit. Like there was a lot of evidence to support like this is a bantamweight in this division, who's a natural grappler, and Ludwig has made great strides with that kind of athletic archetype before. Like this seems like the right move. But that didn't at all work. Like it sounded like he kind of got ground down in training, and maybe it wasn't the. I'm not saying this is exactly what happened in his retirement, but it just seems like that was probably part of the problem he had in terms of actually training consistently. Whereas like at TJ and Dwayne, it just sort of fits like a glove. Like you have a more hard-nosed kind of aggressive fighter who wants to be initiating all the time against someone who's basically giving him all the tools to do that for every second of a fight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I said, I don't really think that there's a correct formula for this. It does seem like a lot of successful fighters tend to bring pieces from everywhere. Like, Leon trained his striking in London, and then it was AKA that kind of taught him wrestling and grappling. But Leon is decidedly not a AKA fighter, if you will. Like Adesanya is not. He doesn't really resemble the kind of protean kickboxer that like Volkanovski and Riddell and Kai Kara France do at City Kickboxing, but he has certainly gained a lot of dimension in his clinch and in his takedown defense, and there have been some tactical adjustments in his kickboxing that he's adapted for MMA. So maybe it is more of a it isn't just sort of like a one person to one coach type synthesis, although obviously it can be. Maybe it is for a broader sense, like bringing pieces from a lot of different places actually tends to amalgamate to the best kind of fighter.
I think people are complex, man. Like having an ideal gym environment or an ideal fighter coach relationship is a lot like having an ideal, familial or romantic relationship. Like how many of them are there? Most of them are dysfunctional in one way or another. So, yeah, I don't know. I think there's so many factors that go into that. How about this? Can we think of an example of a fight that everyone has talked about wanting to see a rematch or something, and then suggest what the appropriate adjustments might be? Hopefully, you guys can think of an example of something that I remember. But I don't know. Anything spring to mind?
Sriram, what do you got?
I'm not sure. I mean, there are a bunch of 3-round fights that I think would change a lot in 5-round rematches, but in general, I think those would kind of have the same plans until the 5-round start feeling themselves, from like Calvin Kattar and Zabit, because Kattar's just going to do the same thing. But I think what's something really? I think, for example, Usman and Covington is something that people have said that they want to see rematches of, and it's something that I'm not particularly interested in personally, but if you're going to look at the kind of adjustments that, for example, Usman can do, it's like there's a lot of room for that, with between the body punching that he did early and kind of beating Covington up, there's a lot of latitude on the feet, and there's just the entire clinch dimension. That's another thing. But in general, I'm not really sure. That's a tough one to think of.
But all of those adjustments, you sort of presuppose they have to fit into the context of Usman pressuring Colby Covington, pushing him back. This is the main thing, is that the adjustments, even if as for Max Holloway, they're not going to be as sticky over the whole course of the fight, they have to fit into the way that person fights, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one unique thing about Max is Max Volk too, is that it's weird because it kind of didn't. If you look at Max in general, it was he wasn't a natural counter puncher, but he figured out a counter uppercut in the beginning of the fight. And he was dropping Volkanovski with singular shots, which is the opposite of what you expect from Max Holloway throughout the entirety of his career. So I think Max is just a fucking prodigy. But I'm not in general.
Well, I would point out that for example, perhaps they were largely aggressive counters. They weren't Max Holloway fighting off the back foot. they were fitting into a style in which Max Holloway goes forward and puts the pace on his opponent and draws things out of them. So I think you could argue that those counterpunches they do slot into his game. It's a style of counterpunching that makes sense for how he feels comfortable fighting.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think one of the uppercut at the end of the second, I think, was him off the back foot. But in general, yeah. I mean, in general, like, it's not something that he's totally bad at, so it's not like he just learned how to counterpunch in the span of a single camp. But it's, yeah, like, for example, in the third fight for Max and Volk, that's something that I think people would want to see. There are a bunch of adjustments that both guys could make. Like, Max, he could keep doing what he was doing in the beginning, obviously, but there are stuff that he could do for Volkanovski's, like leg kicking, that he did better in the second fight, but he could still improve upon. There's Volkanovski maybe varying up his defensive responses off the jab a little bit to keep himself away from the uppercut. Like, that's like one of the few fights where you can look at the entirety of what both guys did and look at like little things they could do to deal with the other. And you can actually trust them to do those things in general, like after the second fight. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the only example I have.
Okay, here's one with lots of room for improvement. What about like Chris Cyborg and Amanda Nunes? Like, right? Very basic level. Very basic level. Don't try to measure dicks with Amanda Nunes. Like, that is an adjustment you can make right off the bat. But there's so much room for growth in that fight that would still totally fit with Cyborg's style. Or we could just talk about like Whittaker Adesanya and what adjustments Rob Whittaker should make. I think that's an interesting one, because there were things I would have liked to see Whittaker do in this most recent fight that he didn't do. That once again sort of broadened my understanding of how his style works, when it works best and when it doesn't. Like, I don't think it would break Rob Whittaker's game to include a whole hell of a lot more body punching. I think that would be a fantastic thing to have in his arsenal when he wants to blitz forward against someone, whether it's Adesanya or Till, who constantly leans back to get away from wild head punches. So I don't know, body punching, low kicks, and body kicks be a very useful addition to the end of a combination that would prevent him from having to lunge so far to get out of range of your opponent's head. Like, that's a pretty small tactical thing to add to his game. That I think he does punch the body. He's good at it. He just doesn't do it enough.
I have one for that fight as well. It may be a bit trickier, but it's one that I know I harped on the last time we talked, was limiting exchanges.
Yes.
Like, I think Rob is actually equipped to do that. There are a lot of fighters in MMA who just don't have the defensive or the offensive depth to, know when to initiate, know when to limit, know when to end an exchange. And so they're just sort of caught out trying to overload, or just they're reacting. Rob is defensively sound enough in the pocket, and he takes good angles on the exit, that he can actually afford to, if he were to just do like a simple like 1-2 upstairs and then to the body with the right hand before angling out, he's equipped to do that. Like, there's nothing about his style that he can't have shorter, snippier combinations before, moving his head offline, pivoting out, and then, resetting. What does make me think it might be a little bit tricky for him is that, as I said, we said earlier, against longer opponents, he really has to commit when he enters. And I think that there may be something where he's like, okay, I'm on the outside, I'm on the outside, I'm on the outside. I need to commit and enter. I have to make it count. Like, I got to make this entry, really matter. I'm going to throw a lot into my left hook, and then, my follow-up right hand. If he wants to extend exchanges beyond that, he has done that before to varying degrees of success.
Do you think do you guys think that's entirely intrinsic? Like, the need to cover huge amounts of, is it impossible to put Whittaker in there with a bunch of lanky training partners and really have him focus on like feinting his way into range, and just, because at a certain level, it just seems like he's uncomfortable with somebody who can touch him at long range. Like, he just hasn't seen enough of them or something. And that if he could calm down, he could, this is an adjustment a million different fighters can make. Get into range before you throw. And Whittaker is a great feinter, and he does this much better against shorter armed opponents. I've always celebrated it as like a highlight of his game, is how well he feints and sets up his entries. But it just doesn't happen against these long rangey guys. So I don't know.
Yeah. But it might be like that may take an experience and like a real like training shift. That may actually be one of those like kind of fight to fight adjustments.
Mhm.
Again, that's sort of what I mean is I don't know how much that's inherent into who like Robert Whittaker is and how
Mhm.
much he feels that he has to make his entries like really, really count.
Right. Or he's at least got to
Or how
land
much of that.
a few of those blitzes
Yeah.
to feel
Yeah.
comfortable, and clearly when he doesn't land the first few, his tactical decision making seems to deteriorate a bit. He starts to get
Yeah.
more and more determined to land those
Desperate
rushes.
even. Yeah. Whereas I think he actually, as I said, he has the skill set to limit exchanges and to pot shot on the outside and to make, to just sort of, as Phil said, take smaller wins. Like
Mm-hmm.
these things, like they will accumulate.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a powerful jab when he really kind of commits to it. As we said, he's a natural counterpuncher when people try to enter in on him. Like there are avenues where he can do that, and if what Whittaker is to beat Adesanya someday, that would be the way that I would recommend he go about it. Like I think that I
Mm-hmm.
think the worst thing that you can do, and that he just kind of kept doing in the first fight, was trying to continue exchanges, and when he didn't land his first strike, he's used to kind of landing his second strike. But against Adesanya, he wouldn't land his first strike, and then he would have difficulty landing his second strike, and then he feels like, all right, I need to land a third strike because my first two didn't land, so there's got to be some merit in this exchange. Like I gotta find something in here that I can hit him with.
And then he would get murked trying to figure out what the third strike was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like as you said, body shots would help remedy that as well. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
bigger, easier target for him to hit, an easier one to hit as he's exiting. So these things do layer. I don't think they all exist in isolation. Like when I wrote the article, I used T.J. Dillashaw and head movement as my primary example. But the truth of the matter is, when it comes to adjusting, typically you want to be adjusting in layers. Like if Rob were to do that, if he was going to say, all right, I'm going to commit to the body like 60% more than I've used to, and I'm going to make a concerted effort not to extend exchanges unless this guy's really worn down and I like really have a read or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The opportunities to land would probably just skyrocket because he is defensively sound enough
Mm-hmm.
most of the time on entry, and diversifying his threats in his plane of attack is never a bad thing. Like that is basically where your opportunities to land increase in probability. If you're forcing an opponent to now consider leg, body, and head strikes, you've tripled your productivity effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that I generally have with expecting Whitaker to make that kind of adjustment, and it's not just that adjustment, it's what you mentioned, Danny, in the last episode, is that Whitaker's style probably won't age well, and it's something that I think Tuman mentioned, which is that older fighters tend not to like be tend to attack in smaller motions in terms of footwork and not like the big explosions. I think Whitaker he is who he is at heart, and the blitzes are just what he does. So like if I were to say Robert Whitaker box your way in, it would probably lead to the problem we talked about in the first example of adjustments, which is he thinks too much, he doesn't blitz in, he just doesn't do much at all, or he just does it wrong because he's been thinking too much about it. So I think it's like I think there's a route for Robert Whittaker against Israel Adesanya, but at this point I think it would take a lot of changing who he is as a fighter to like not blitz in as aggressively, and it's tough to ask a fighter to do that as they age. Like there are a lot of examples of fighters maturing. Like we mentioned Anthony Pettis, who didn't make the right adjustments in terms of like his core problems, but he did mature as a fighter and turning from like a kicker to like a counterpuncher at this point, which is
Mm-hmm.
super weird, but it's something that he did.
It's the
And like
Shogun Hua track.
yeah, exactly. That's actually a great comparison. It's he started out as a kicker who was better at grappling, and now he's just a counterpuncher. But I think there are examples of fighters making those kinds of adjustments. It's just that again, it's hard to expect fighters to do that for specific opponents as much as it is to expect them to do it for flaws they see with themselves. So I don't expect fighters to like even Robert Whittaker, who I consider very highly in terms of like fight IQ in general.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to expect them to make those kinds of adjustments for specific opponents.
Yeah. he is a good adjuster, but he is likely still to be making the kind of adjustments that Robert Whittaker makes. That there are certain patterns that are just like endemic to who he is. I think, along those lines, like, I don't know, what happened to that front kick that worked so well against Joel Romero to keep Whittaker in a pressuring position, to keep his opponent pushing back? That would be a great move. I think the right adjustments would be just like tacking on a few other ideas. That's essentially what Max Holloway did against Volkanovski. Like I said, they sort of rusted away after a couple rounds. After Volkanovski started to adjust, it turns out that Volkanovski, fighting his usual way, just had a deeper bag of tricks than the new Max Holloway. But that's essentially all Max did for that fight. It's just like add on a couple new moves. He was still basically Max Holloway, but he just added on a couple specific answers to the things. The advantage of having lost the first fight. He added on specific answers to what gave him trouble the first time around. I do think all of that's possible, but what you said, Sriram, is basically the reason I've downgraded my expectations for any Whittaker-Adesanya rematch from, Whittaker could win that, to Whittaker could lose but look a lot better doing it. He could, you know what I mean? He could come in with better tools, better suited to the situation, but it now feels very concretely like the styles are tied to their personalities, and Robert Whittaker is going to have a hard time ever beating Israel Adesanya.
We invited you onto the show to talk about adjustments, Connor, but I almost feel like a better subtitle is going to be like fighter maturation. Because that sort of seems like where a lot of this conversation is drifting back to, is like, how much faith can you put in a fighter themselves to find the discipline and their, the tact to not just adjust, but to continue adjusting. Like, I think I give Max a lot of credit for the adjustments he made versus Volkanovski, but he did adjust, whereas Volkanovski, I think, continued adjusting, was kind of the difference.
Yeah, Max came in with some new weapons, but Volkanovski adjusted on the fly to the new things that Max brought, and those stuck to the end of the fight. Like, however you feel about the score, it definitely felt to me that Volkanovski had figured the new Max out once again by the end of the fight.
By the fifth round. And so that's like, in some ways, that's kind of a bit of an, like, even a more interesting topic. It's just like, in sort of contextualizing this whole discussion is like, we are in a very comfortable position. And I always try to remind myself this if I'm being critical of a fighter, I'm writing something, I have to kind of take a step back and just sort of examine where I am and what I am observing from where I'm sitting. It is very easy for us to take a look at fighters and identify things that they could do with improving. Say like hitting the body more, which I feel like we say every single episode, Sriram.
I do some scouting reports for a couple fighters and coaches, and I always make it sound like it's like a specific opening for this particular opponent, but basically everyone says throw jabs and hit them in the body.
Hit them in the body. Yeah,
yes.
Truly. We can identify things that we see, but it's also, you also kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of a fighter and think to yourself, like, what could be preventing them from doing this? It could be that maybe Rob knocked Till down and he just kind of felt like this guy he is like 5 clean punches away from being hurt again or being finished, like, or whatever. Maybe with the Holloway Volk rematch,
I definitely got that vibe there that Max was like, oh my God, it's working. He got comfortable again, and then he just became classic Max Holloway.
And then, in the fifth round, Volk was like, I think I got a handle on you now. Like, and the likelihood of me getting dropped again is fairly low. Like, if that could be something too. Or maybe it's a training thing. Maybe in training they try something out and they get hurt for it, or they get punched in the face for it, and then they're immediately disincentivized from trying it again.
It's the horse thing.
Yeah, it is. Like, it is absolutely the horse thing. It's a great example. I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
Well,
I was just gonna say I talk about this all the time with like the example that always jumps to mind is clearly it jumps to mind is Talis Latus.
Yeah.
Who anytime
Against
anybody
Silva.
hits him with a jab, he has Anderson Silva flashbacks. He starts to have PTSD. It's a real thing. Like, yeah, it's fun to laugh at, but like there genuinely is PTSD associated with fighting. Getting hit by another person who wants to kill you is traumatic. And yeah, those leave like lingering impressions. I don't know, how did Jose Aldo's body language look when he realized that the Max Holloway rematch was unfolding exactly the same way as the first one?
Yeah. I actually wasn't even thinking of that specifically. I was thinking of just even in a tactical sense, like Aldo is someone who will like. This is kind of like one of the few technical criticisms I actually have with him is that he is a fighter who, well, at least during his title reign, he was someone who like if he felt that like a tool was there, he would use it. But if if someone could disincentivize him from using his tool, he would shelf the tool. He wouldn't like
figure out how to make it work.
Yes. Right. And so when Max kind of flurried at him off a leg kick, his takeaway was, oh, he's ready for the leg kicks. Got to do something else. Like that's out. Can't use that. Whereas you look at a fighter, another adjuster like Volkanovski, and Volkanovski was like in the first fight against Max, like he would get jabbed, and as the fight progressed, Max figured out more ways to kind of counter Volkanovski's leg kicks, but it didn't deter him from landing it. He's like, all right, I kind of need to figure out something else to get in there. I need to find different entries to actually land this tool. I'm not getting rid of it, but I'm adapting with it.
You just need to figure out how to hide it. That's all.
Yeah, right. And I guess that's kind of that's why technical depth means anything.
Mm-hmm.
But it is sort of telling, like how much you can learn about a fighter just by how they, adjust, big or small, how they adapt and mature over time. I think that horse analogy is a really good one because I'm now like I'm now wondering. I've had like half a dozen fighters running through my mind. I'm like, how many of them would react this way if they were put? Fuck knows, how does Cody react? Like if he makes it to a title shot and Peter Yan starts like, angling off to his right to set, in southpaw and starts trying to set up a right hook, like.
Oh, Cody Garbrandt's still in there.
He's got to be in there, right?
The horse lives on inside, no doubt.
Yeah, so it's just kind of, maybe parting thoughts a bit, but that does kind of leave me thinking about, what kinds of fighters and what fighters, on the other hand, actually can overcome it. Like what kind of, are there fighters who can have bad experiences and then not only learn from them, adjust from them, but then if they're put in a similar position, can they recognize that and kind of reset?
I'm going to give you two very distant examples. George St. Pierre, I think a very intellectual fighter. One of the rare, like, all-terrain fighters. Someone whose style was capable of succeeding if he's moving forward, moving backward, could work at a high pace or a low pace against a wide variety of opponents. I think, and a guy who we know, too, is, like, even more than a lot of fighters, like, sort of anxious and overthinks things, and has his, sort of famously at this point, has his, like, paranoid conspiratorial thinking. So yeah, like that's an example. Another one though, Derek Lewis. One day, Derek Lewis figured out that if he just stopped freaking out on the ground, he would start to beat people when they got tired from grappling with him. And that was literally him, like, overcoming the anxiety he had about being put in a comfortable position, overcoming that traumatic experience of having been beaten there and exhausted there before. Now it's a really stupid heavyweight style adjustment, but it really worked. It was like, I see it as the turning point of his entire career. So it's possible, but it's tough. Like I said, most people really, really struggle to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I say when, like, we start to rag on, like, Calvin Kattar and stuff, is an adjustment in MMA. if you see someone adjust, it's a discreetly good thing more than not adjusting is a bad thing.
Yeah, fighting is stressful, man. How good are any of us at adjusting and like thoughtfully changing our approach when we're extremely stressed out?
Yeah, like if you look at a specifically adjustable fighter, it's like you can't look at the entire field and be like, why aren't they like this? Just because it's genuinely abnormal.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, you look at like Edward Vartanian or something, it's like, hey, everyone should be like Edward Vartanian. No one's like Edward Vartanian. That's why he's Vartanian. So if you look at a fighter who just like, you know, he gets hit with the same things over and over, it's just sometimes fighters just are who they are, and who they are aren't very smart.
You are either the kind of person who adjusts, right? Like that's just you're a person who stays very thoughtful and very calm under pressure, and I think sometimes that's just tied to experience. You know, like I think of James Toney. That guy could always make adjustments because his training regimen was just going into the gym and letting like a new fresh guy each round go in there and try to take his hat off. He cultivated an eerie sense of calm in the midst of a crazy brawl, and that made him. It allowed him to think about the big picture of his fights while he was in the middle of them. So either you're a guy who adjusts and that gets revealed, or you're like pretending. You know, you're pretending, you're tacking some new things on, and then once those are answered, once those are taken away, you're just the same guy again.
You mean like Frankie Edgar's spin kicks?
What a beautiful adjustment. You know what's a great example of a tactical addition that did not solve? We talked about Anthony Pettis' new wrestling defense, but my favorite example has always been Junior Dos Santos against Cain Velasquez, adding like an up elbow as he turned his back and ran along the fence. Like this was his new move that was going to prevent Cain Velasquez from exploiting that habit. Didn't fix the habit. But, you know, to be fair, like, obviously, look at Junior. It's hard. Like, he's just never been able to get over being Junior Dos Santos. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I like the elbows, Connor.
Well, they were great. Yeah, I like them, too.
It really seemed to put Kane off his game plan. I think it was a win. I think that is probably a good note to end on. Like I said, with all these discussions, they always kind of end up morphing into something else. So maybe like adjustment and maturation is what we should call this thing. But thank you so much for coming on our show, Connor. It was awesome to have you back. You're welcome on anytime. And to those, let's start engaging the audience a little bit, Sriram. Let's say like leave a comment down below.
No. You guys have to adopt.
Smash that motherfucking like and subscribe.
You guys have to adopt the heavy hands ethos, which is fuck the fans. I'm so sorry, listeners.
Wow.
You are nothing. You are lucky to be receiving this analysis from me and Danny, and yes, even Sriram. You're blessed.
Yeah.
To receive these.
We'll take that as a review, Connor. No, but seriously, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and thank you for having me and even tolerating me for like an hour.
Do you have anything coming out this week? Do you have any articles in the back burner?
Hell no. I mean, I always have a lot of articles on the back burner. But I got heavy hands. So this week, Phil and I are obviously going to be talking about Robert Whittaker, Darren Till. We're going to have to give some credit to Darren Till. We're going to have to, I don't know, have very mixed, confusing emotions about Robert Whittaker. That should be fun. And what's next week's card again?
Brunson Shabazian.
Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about that, too.
Are you? Yeah. I thought that would have put you off.
Well, we might. I mean, we'll try.
At least it isn't Home Aldana.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
A little better.
Yeah, it's better.
Sriram, do you have anything coming out this week?
I don't think so. Like I was doing articles like a bunch during June, and now I've just like not done a ton this time. So it's
Hey,
like
you know
just because June was super rich.
Final shout, just because you mentioned him, Derek Brunson. That's a guy who's made some stylistic adjustments several times.
Hell yeah!
Right?
It only took him like 6 knockout losses, but he got there.
He went from being a totally different fighter to being the Derek Brunson we know and love, and now he's another, even more totally different kind of fighter, which is kind of impressive.
I mean, it's kind of funny because I think like stupid running forward with his left hand Brunson might actually have more success against like elite fighters.
Yeah.
It's like at least you're giving yourself like a 15% chance of a critical hit as opposed to like shitty technical outside fighting.
Maybe Derek Brunson really is like a light heavyweight at heart. I never thought about that, but yeah, right. I have 2 articles that I think I'm kind of working on. I don't know if they'll be out this week, but one of them is a new kind of series I want to dabble into, which is like a bit of a hypothetical analysis. So I'd be like taking, what would have happened if this fighter from 2015, instead of doing whatever it is they did, went on to fight this fighter from the same period. It's not exactly like a prime versus prime. But like the one I'm working with right now is like, what would have happened if GSP had gone straight from the Hendricks fight to fighting Robbie Lawler, around like late 2013, early 2014? Like, what would that look like? So I'll see how that goes. And then the other one is, I'm gonna try to do a TJ Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt tetherball analysis, where I'm gonna look at their.
I have legit used that as a piece of fight analysis.
It's useful. It's
it
like
is.
actually
It's
Ryan
totally,
did on the Cody Garbrandt pod.
it is totally the same dynamic you had in their fights.
Yeah,
100%.
It's like perfect.
Yep.
And so I kind of want to, and I'll mix in some actual, because I always enjoy writing about TJ. He's a really fun fighter to break down. So I'll work in some technical analysis here and there. But I was thinking about that the other day, and I'm like, oh man, that actually might be a really fun article. Like that could, I could probably mine a lot out of that.
I just want to see more fighters taking each other on in like 1v1 basketball, like tennis singles. I just want to see how that stylistic dynamic translates to other sports. I think it would probably correlate better than we might expect.
I bet you're right.
Yeah, the personality thing.
Absolutely.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and the tetherball game was like the perfect example. Like it just encapsulated both men to such a flawless degree. Which is like I said, part of the reason I want to write about it. So I guess I got those coming out. Be sure to stay tuned on Bloody Elbow. See, we're even plugging your site now, Connor. And Heavy Hands, go join their Patreon. As far as the fight site, continue checking our stuff. Sriram and I and all the other talented writers at the fight site have stuff coming out pretty consistently. I think it's not next week is Cormier Stipe 3, right? It's the week after. We got one more week.
3 weeks. It's like we've got
3 weeks.
Brunson. Yeah, we've got like Brunson Shabazian now, and then Lewis Olenek, which is a dazzling main event, and then and then DC Stipe.
Okay.
We don't have another weekend off till October. That's all I know.
And I consider both of those weekends off.
What? Oh God. Okay. Well, I guess we'll see. Yeah, I guess we'll find out. But again, stay tuned to the fight site. Be sure to check out Hyperfly. You can go to the link at the very bottom of the fight site's main page. Click it and you will get a discount. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. Thank you again, Connor, for coming on the show. And please stay safe.